Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. We're super excited to have Professor Caroline Fredrickson here with us today. And before we jump in with the questions, we're going to read a quick bio and then we're going to get to it. So, Caroline Fredrickson served as a distinguished visiting professor from practice at Georgetown Law and is a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. She served as the president of the American Constitution Society from 2009 to 2019 and published works on many legal and constitutional issues and is a frequent guest on television and radio, including serving as a regular on-air commentator on impeachment. Before joining ACS, Fredrickson served as the director of the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office and as general counsel and legal director of NARAL Pro-Choice America. In addition, she served as the chief of staff to Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington and deputy chief of staff to then Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle of South Dakota. During the Clinton administration, she served as special assistant to the president for legislative affairs. Professor Fredrickson is an elected member of the American Law Institute, co-chair of the National Constitution Center's Coalition of Freedom Advisory Board, and a member of If When How's Advisory Board, and on the boards of American Oversight and the National Institute of Money and Politics. In 2015, Fredrickson was appointed a member of the Yale Les Aspin Fellowship Committee. In 2021, President Biden asked Professor Fredrickson to serve on its Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. Professor Fredrickson received her JD from Columbia Law School with honors and her BA from Yale University in Russian and East European Studies, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. She clerked for the Honorable James L. Oaks of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. So, Professor Fredrickson, thank you for joining us today. We're super excited.
It's such a pleasure to be with you.
All right, our first question. You made a decision to use your legal background to focus on legislation and policy in the Clinton White House and on Capitol Hill. Advocacy and representation at the ACLU, become one of the legal scholars in the progressive movement while heading the American Constitution Society, law professor at Georgetown Law School, and also an author and scholar with institutions such as the Brennan Center. Can you please share what motivated you to become a lawyer and then use your legal training for both advocacy and scholarship?
Well, first, let me say what a pleasure it is to be with you and how impressed I am with what you're doing and how I so much believe in the importance of what you're doing. So thank you for launching your organization and your podcast and your website and all of that. It's really inspiring. So why did I do this? I really I've been interested in politics all my life, and when I graduated from college, I decided to go and work in Washington. And I started working on Capitol Hill, and I worked for a wonderful congressman from Illinois. And but I decided that I got the kind of the campaign bug, and I decided to run off to Iowa and work on a presidential campaign. And all of that being said, I found it fascinating, but I wasn't quite finding what I needed on the campaign. I had really loved working for the congressman, but the campaigns, I was working as an organizer, which is such an important part of the campaign, but it wasn't super intellectually stimulating. So I thought, well, maybe law school will help give me the kind of intellectual framework for the work that I do in politics, and I can become, I can play a different role in the political world than I'm playing now as a low-level organizer in Iowa. So I went to law school, and I had become fascinated with and passionate about workplace issues. Well, I was working in Iowa. I worked with a lot of union people, and it was very eye-opening for me because I grew up in a academic family. My parents were both professors. And I just didn't have a whole lot of exposure, except knowing that I was against discrimination. And this brought the kind of organized labor, kind of the value of coming together in solidarity. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go to law school and learn about that, learn about labor law, employment law. So I went to law school. I really, I guess I was pretty different from a lot of the other law students. I took labor law, I took employment law, I took all the civil rights classes, I took women in the law, and advanced labor seminars, and so, I came out and I thought, okay, this is really what I want to do. So I did work at a union side labor law firm for a couple of years, and then I went to Capitol Hill and I started working on labor policy and judiciary policy. So there was sort of all of a long way to say, it was kind of politics that brought me to it, thinking that the law would be a way to help me engage in politics in a way that was substantive and meaningful. and hopefully it would make a difference.
Jumping into politics now that you just mentioned, today we are 21 days away from what many call the most consequential election in America's history. From your vantage point, can you share your perspectives on the legal issues that are at stake in November?
Absolutely. And I think this won't surprise you because you know that I work a lot on Supreme Court issues and on court issues generally, but the presidency is incredibly important. The president has so much power, but the people who get to stay in power for their entire lifetimes, the only ones are the federal judges. And the Supreme Court, above them all, wields an enormous amount of power in our political system. And they're not doing any good right now. Their recent decisions have been incredibly harmful. I think your audience probably knows about quite a number of them. Obviously, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade, terrible decisions on guns, and of course, the recent decision providing former President Trump with immunity for actions he took as president, and most likely making it impossible to hold him account for his effort to overturn the rightfully elected government of President Biden to prevent Biden from being inaugurated. He will probably, under this decision, it will be very hard to prosecute him for that. So, the Supreme Court for me and the courts generally are an incredibly important part of this. And who the next president is will determine the direction of our country for the next 50 years in that light, because there will be potentially some vacancies to fill. And if it's President Trump, it's going to be a disaster, an absolute disaster. It's already a disaster with his 3 appointees and then adding to the appointees of President Bush. We have a far right court that is incredibly ideological and very much wedded to a view of our country that's based on how the country was run in the 18th century, which I think for all of us listening to this podcast and talking to you, that's not good for us. It is not good for us. And we've already seen the fruits of that court. Imagine if there were more like Sam Alito and more like Clarence Thomas. It's going to be very bad.
Yeah, that's an understatement for sure. We're all holding our breath, I guess, for the next 21 days. But shifting a little bit towards the candidates, in the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen the incredible rise of women on the national stage, the first female Speaker of the House, and now 2 women have become the presidential nominee of a major national parties. There are several women governors, and of course, we're at the cusp of possibly electing the first female president. So I'd like to ask you to speak about 2 different things. The first, can you place this rise into a broader context and discuss what you think of the progress, what's going well, and as we look ahead, where is there still room for growth and improvement?
Well, it's obviously very exciting. I mean, it's taken way too long. Presidential systems are harder than parliamentary systems. There's a lot of people might say, well, Margaret Thatcher and Golda Meir and Mrs. Gandhi, India, but the parliamentary systems are very different, right? They're not a popularly elected president. They are chosen by their peers inside the parliament. And so there have been many examples in other countries of women who've led their countries, but have been prime ministers and not presidents. So it's really a very, very important development. And my great hope that we have a woman president, and not just in my lifetime, but right now, in 3 weeks, I want to know that we have a woman president for so many reasons. But I mean, this is, so to put it in context, I want to make sure people understand that we're not necessarily that far behind other countries because we haven't had a woman president, because it is that much harder to elect a woman through a popular vote. Nancy Pelosi is probably more akin to the prime ministers. She's been incredible. She really helped set the stage for what a powerful woman can look like, how she can behave, be respected, and not be considered a monster and unfeminine or whatever. She's had tremendous impact on the development of policy and politics in this country, and I have huge amounts of respect for her. She really helped make this happen. She helped make this moment happen in many ways. So, we have a lot to do because there's obviously a lot of sexism, and for Kamala Harris, there's a lot of racism, and she's got to overcome both of those very pernicious aspects of our political system and our society. And so, I'm afraid that there's always a little bit that people don't admit to in polling and focus groups about why they might be uncomfortable with her, that go to those aspects. So we've got to be really conscious of that. But the more there are women and people of color in the political world running for high office and succeeding, the more of us will have a chance to succeed. So it's not over till it's over, as I guess Yogi Berra said. So everybody needs to get out there and do whatever they can to make this possibility a reality.
And while we're on the topic of women leaders, I'd love to talk about your book, The AOC Way, The Secrets of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Success. Would you mind telling our listeners why you decided to write that book, what it's about, and what young women can learn from AOC's still evolving story and rise to drive real change and make an impact?
Well, that was just such a fun book to write because she is really an inspiration, coming on the scene like she did so quickly and making such an impact and having such a strong vision of who she was and what she stands for. And I was really taken by understanding her background, how she got to be where she is so young, and to be such a dynamic leader, and have made such a difference in people's lives. And so I looked at, how she communicates, and how she, well, first of all, what happened in her life that made it possible for her to do this. And she came through some very difficult moments. So, she was kind of forged through some real trials, and sadness of her death of her father quite early, and losing their house in a very complicated situation in terms of the probate after her father's death, and learning a lot about politics in that moment, about why the probate courts are so powerful in New York and the political, chicanery that goes on. And so I kind of delved into that, and then along the way I learned about, about her trajectory, her working in a bar, and getting interested in politics and starting to just go out there until she gets recruited to run for office because she was such a dynamo. And she uses social media so effectively to communicate to a really broad audience, to bring a lot of younger people into politics. And I thought that was so exciting, to see how she could use those kinds of tools that most Democrats, honestly, there's old fogies on now. Congress is full of, quite ancient people, as we all know, and that they didn't know what she was up to, but she really expanded the number of people who were all of a sudden interested in what was going on up there. And I just think that I have a tremendous amount of respect for that, and I hope there was a lot of learning done by other members of Congress, at least the ones that I like, and how to and how to make those tools work for them too.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I can attest to the fact that it's a great book, and I definitely do think everyone should read it.
Thank you.
Moving,
Available now at your favorite bookstore.
yeah, actually, I'll put the Amazon link in your.
All right.
Adding on to the topic of women's issues, something that's been at the forefront of this campaign is reproductive freedom. And as we discussed earlier, you served as the director of the ACLU's Washington Legislation Office and General Counsel, and legal director of NARAL Pro-Choice America. These roles were preceding the current composition of the Supreme Court and the Dobbs decision. But given your leadership in this area and your observations about the direction of the law regarding reproductive freedom, can you please provide listeners a sense of the twists and the turns in the law and what's at stake in this election, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level?
Yeah, well, this has been a long battle. The conservative right has had its eyes on Roe since Roe was issued. So, the decision in the early 70s immediately raised a ruckus on the right, and they have been working ever since to have it overturned. They've built their movement to destroy the rights of women, and very effectively. And they did it. Now back to the courts, because I'm always going to talk about the courts, but by cultivating young lawyers, law students, and those in the legal community to be interested in becoming judges and indoctrinate them in an approach to legal interpretation and constitutional interpretation that is fiercely anti-woman, anti-civil rights, and with the whole objective of undoing the successes of the civil rights movement, and the women's rights movement. And we're seeing that happen with the judges that they put on the bench, not to mention issuing decisions like, giving Donald Trump a get out of jail free card. I don't know if people still play Monopoly, but if you played Monopoly, that was a card that you could get, the get out of jail free card. And so there's I think that's very important to understand, that the sort of the long-term process here of building and cultivating a movement on the right, a legal movement that would enable these important decisions to be undone, decisions protecting our most fundamental rights. Every time the Supreme Court issues an opinion, we're all panicked about what is it going to do now. And so, I think there have been a series of decisions along the way that showed how antagonistic this court was to women's having control over their own bodies, from the partial birth abortion decision to, the chipping away. And Dobbs was just, the sort of the end point of that process. And it is just so incredibly disingenuous of Republicans and of members of the court to say, we just turned it back to the states. Well, yeah, because you knew what the states were going to do. You absolutely did it so that they would pass draconian laws that ban abortion with no exceptions. Women are dying. Women are dying because they have a pregnancy that maybe they wanted, but it's endangering their lives. In order for them to save themselves, they need to have an abortion, and those states are refusing it. And if they can't get to another state soon enough, there have been women who've died. So that's what they've decided is a better outcome than women choosing what happens to their own bodies. Let them die. And so this is going to continue. There is another case involving emergency medicine, which the Supreme Court basically didn't decide in the last term, sent it back to the state. Idaho, they're basically saying, we don't care if you're dying. There is a federal law that says that hospitals have to provide services to people who are needing critical care. And Idaho passed a law that says, no abortion, no how, no never. And, they said they would not adhere to this law, which is called EMTLA, which is the Emergency Medicine, and I can't remember the rest of the acronym, Act. And so it sets up a conflict between the state law and the federal law. And the Supreme Court basically decided not to decide it, but it's coming back. And it's going to be very explicit. I think the Supreme Court saying, you know what, women's rights are worthless. And so if we continue down this path, it's no exaggeration to say Margaret Atwood was completely, she's visionary. The Handmaid's Tale is on its way, if it's not here already.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Well, as you say, everything comes back to the courts. So in light of all these problems, I'd like to ask you about constitutional reform. A few years ago, the National Constitution Center launched an initiative to analyze the U.S. Constitution from varying philosophical and legal viewpoints, and you worked with Professors Melissa Murray and Jamal Green to write what you guys call the Progressive Constitution. Would you mind telling us about this project? Why did the National Constitution Center sponsor it, and what are the key features of it?
Well, sure. It was a really fascinating project. We were actually asked to, there were 3 groups and I led the progressive team, and we were asked to come up with our own constitution. And we really deliberated about how to approach this. Modern constitutions, and by that I mean constitutions that have been written in the last 50 years, in various countries are nothing like the US Constitution typically, except interestingly, the Russian Constitution. Um, they deviate greatly because they, first of all, they're much more explicit about the types of rights that are protected, and about the kinds of tests that are supposed to be used to evaluate competing rights. Because I think, people have to understand that is the major, typical, a major constitutional question when you're looking at something like abortion is the question of competing rights. So the rights of the mother versus the rights of the fetus, or even the rights of the state in the pregnancy. And so, they're much more explicit about how do you analyze those kinds of questions, at what point does the right tip towards one party or another. The US Constitution is super vague and very short. So, but we did not, what we're doing was mostly an exercise of pedagogy. So that is, the National Constitution Center is a site for school groups, particularly to educate them about US history and the Constitution. And so we thought we want to approach people and students, especially, in a way that seems, understandable, that will actually get them to think about the current debates we have about the Constitution. So instead of rewriting it completely from scratch and writing a constitution that looks more like the South African or the German constitutions, which are both seen as, models, we took the US Constitution and kept the framework and kept the basic way that it was approached. But we did a few things that were critical. One was we created essentially an ERA in the Constitution, and we provided for a right to vote, and we protected, bodily integrity. So we didn't have a laundry list of rights, but we did ensure that some most basic aspects of human dignity were protected, and basic aspects of democracy were protected. We got rid of the Electoral College, for example. We changed the structure of the Senate to some extent, so it wasn't so lopsided in favor of the small states. But it was a very interesting exercise because along the way, the conservative team and the libertarian team came up with constitutions, and it turned out there were a few areas where there was overlap. And so we had a little mini constitutional convention, and we came up with 5 amendments that we agreed on. And I think what's important here is that we agreed on term limits for Supreme Court justices. And that is an area where there is such broad consensus that we should not have life terms for judges generally. We should certainly not have them for the Supreme Court. And so that I think was a significant development. And I hope it gave some life to the efforts that are going on right now to impose term limits on the Supreme Court.
That's really interesting that that's one of the main things that everyone agreed on. So I'd like to ask you, jumping off of that, about your time on President Biden's Supreme Court Commission, and how you guys analyze term limits, jurisdiction restrictions, supermajority rules for voting in constitutional cases, ethics reforms, and court expansion. So 2 questions about your experience on the commission. The first being, where did the commission land on these issues? And then in light of significant concern about the legitimacy and objectivity of the current Supreme Court, what needs to happen to return to a sense of respect and high regard for the court?
Wow. Okay. So our mandate was not to come up with a position. It was to provide an analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the different ideas. And so what we did was we broke into subgroups, and we each handled different sections of that. But essentially, as you say, what we analyzed those questions because those were the ones that seemed to be the major issues that people were discussing around reforms. And so the term limits is clear. People know what that is, and there's a general consensus around 18 years. And the commission analyzed that and described some of the complexities that involved the implementation process. When does it start? Does it affect current justices, only future justices? And then we looked at ethics rules. And some other really obvious issues like, should there be more transparency around the court? Should there be, cameras in the courtroom? Should there And then jurisdiction issues. So for example, can we make the court, are there areas where the court should be kept out of, right? Limiting the jurisdiction of the court in certain categories, or should there be a requirement that if they're overturning a statute of Congress on the basis saying it's unconstitutional, should they have to vote as a supermajority if they're going to overturn a law passed by our democratically elected branches? Because one of the major issues in constitutional law is the fact that we're supposed to be a democracy, and the court undermines a democracy because it overturns statutes that are passed by Congress. When it says they're unconstitutional, there's nothing really Congress can do about it, or very little. So we recognize that that's important in certain situations, because Congress can do some bad stuff, right? Congress can pass laws that are highly discriminatory, punitive, dangerous in certain ways. So, it's a check on the worst tendencies of the political branches, but how do we make sure it doesn't go too far? So those were really the questions we looked at. And I'm sorry, I forgot your second question now.
The significant, or in light of significant concern of the legitimacy and objectivity of the Supreme Court, how can we return it to a sense of respect?
Okay, so I would say for me personally, and I'm speaking not for the commission because we did not take positions, I believe very strongly in term limits. But I also think they need to be imposed, right away. I think that there needs to be a mechanism that may include a short-term expansion of the court in order to allow the term limits to be imposed on the next selections of a president. And the way that the term limits proposal works is every president would get 2. And based on the demographics of the court, meaning how old they are, on projections of how long they will stay on, whether willingly or unwillingly, or whether they will leave willingly or by, the end of, by becoming ill or dying. This would potentially increase the size of the court for a very short time. It's actually the proposal that was advanced by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences working group that I was on, that I think is a very good way of getting it going immediately without engaging in the controversy of whether it applies to Clarence Thomas right away, whether, he's term limited, because guess what? Clarence Thomas has served way more than 18 years. So he would be gone, and so would several of the others. So that's a controversy. Now, I could speak to that too, but I think this other proposal is a kind of a clever way of getting out of that debate, because it brings along a lot more Republicans who might not want to say it, even if I do want to get Clarence Thomas out of there right away, they might not want to join us. So, that's an interesting approach. I think ethics rules are critical. It just makes me ill to think about the misbehavior going on the court, the lavish lifestyles, the gifts. I mean, it's corrupt. It's corruption. There's no other way to look at it. And so there have to be ethics rules applied. Without these two things, the American public is never going to respect the court again.
What would the logistics be implementing term limits? I know we just talked about for the next president, they would have their pick, but in what way or where would we put that into law, and how would we actually implement
Right. So there's another debate. I think there are quite a lot of us, the majority of professors and constitutional scholars and others, who think that this can be done through statute, that you can actually impose term limits without getting in violation of Article 3 is the part of the Constitution that establishes the courts. And it says that judges serve during good behavior. So there's a debate about whether or not you could impose term limits, but you can, because there's already a system where lower court judges serve as senior judges, and they can sit on other courts. And a lot of the retired Supreme Court justices do that. Justice Breyer isn't just sitting at home, knitting. He is going around the country and sitting on different courts. And Justice Souter has, for a long time, after he left the Supreme Court, served on the First Circuit. And so we already have a system in place where justices keep working, but they just do it in a different way. And so there's still, it's still life tenure, but they can be term limited on the Supreme Court in that particular role.
Thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it. Now switching over to the last question, I like to end with advice normally to our listeners.
Okay.
So I know that a lot of what we talked about has been regarding the law and making changes that way. But for many of us who are either too young or haven't had the chance to go to law school, what are some ways that you think would be helpful in getting involved and advocating?
Well, just get involved and advocate. I think you don't need a law degree to do that. I mean, look at you. Look at what you're doing, which is, you're making your opinions heard. Your voices are so important. You volunteer. Just because you may not be old enough to vote, it doesn't mean you can't participate in the political world. You can go door knock for a candidate. You can make phone calls. I know you were doing some of that. So, getting out with a candidate and going to a rally, putting a bumper sticker on your parents' car or your own car if you have one. But get out there. There's nothing that holds you back. Just because you may not be old enough to vote, doesn't mean you can't make a difference, because you're almost there. And some of you may already be voting, and so vote for sure. Vote for sure. Tell other people to vote. Help register to people to vote. I mean, there's just 1,000 ways you can get involved. If you care about reproductive rights, contact your local chapter of the Planned Parenthood or one of the other reproductive rights groups, or the ACLU, which does a lot of reproductive rights work, or any number of other organizations, and let them know you'd like to volunteer. It's a great experience. And by the way, it doesn't look bad on your college application. So and that's helpful too. But yeah, you're not a passive part of this society. Don't let other people tell you what is going to happen to your life. It's up to you to make sure that society reflects what you want.
Yeah, I even think the easiest way is a lot of what we've been talking about on campaign calls, or as you mentioned, like phone banking and canvassing, is making sure you have a plan on election day to go vote. And that kind of begins with making sure everyone in your family has a plan.
There you go. Exactly.
They reach out to people and they bring their friends. And so, yeah, it can start from a smaller place and then expand.
Exactly. Exactly. That's for sure. So, well, as I said, I really admire what you're doing. You're not starting from a small place. You're starting from a big place, or maybe you started from a small place, but it's grown a lot. So thank you for that. And this is terrific. And, all of you who are listening, get out there and get involved and bring your family.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time and for answering all these questions and helping us out. I really appreciate it.
Well, anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.